I've been a mental health therapist off and on since 2013. And I say off and on because in 2016, my wife and I moved to Uganda to do some mission work. So I closed down my practice, and she's a school teacher. She quit teaching, and at the time we had an 18-month-old little boy. And we found out 2 weeks before we left for Uganda she was pregnant. So we went there and didn't counsel for a few years, and then reopened my practice in 2018 and have been going nonstop ever since. I didn't expect to get into PTSD and trauma. In fact, when I started counseling, I'm like, I will never do PTSD or trauma, because it was like the subject that scared me most, and it had the most critical outcomes, and so I'm like, I don't even want to mess with that. So I'm just going to stick with these other things that I know how to do. And yet I just kept bumping into it over and over and over. And so I got to the point where I was like, I don't know if I can continue to be a quality therapist doing the work that I do without knowing how to work with people with PTSD and trauma. And so I did some research, found the most research-based ways of working with PTSD and trauma, thought to myself, I have some trauma. And as we'll see in the statistics in a minute, a lot of us, in fact, most of us, have experienced something traumatic at some point. And so I took that, found a therapist who does EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which I'll share a little bit more about later, but found that it really helped me. So then I went and got certified, and I've been primarily working with PTSD and trauma ever since. I feel like those things are not understood well. Trauma is real. Trauma is life-changing. Trauma, it hijacks everything, and yet there still is hope that we can do something with it, and we can serve people with it. How many of you are familiar with the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experiences? This was a study done by the CDC, and it was done, I want to say, like 2013. And what they kind of held down is like these adverse childhood experiences come down into three categories. There's abuse, there's neglect, there's household dysfunction. People who have an experience in one or more of those areas has experienced trauma by definition. We'll get into the difference between trauma and PTSD, but they've experienced trauma by definition if they have experienced even in one area of these three domains. Just one can be traumatic. Complex trauma comes in when it's more than one effect of trauma. And complex trauma is one of the key words now in trauma work that we do. Complex trauma is when we experience physical abuse, we experience emotional neglect, and we experience, on top of a mental illness, mother treated violently, substance abuse, like all of those elements being creating layers of trauma that have different effects than if it was just even one element of trauma. And just to also throw out there, just because they have experienced something hurtful, something painful, something that you would recognize as, man, that would be traumatic for me, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've experienced trauma. I believe that when we were created and when the Lord created us, that we were given what we needed emotionally and mentally to overcome the bad things that are inevitably going to happen to us. And so a lot of people will judge themselves for experiencing trauma for something that they wouldn't consider that bad. And then there's some people who don't have trauma symptoms and they've experienced something that is significantly bad that would check the box of being traumatic. So I do want us to be careful that just because a person experienced one of these things in childhood or late adolescence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have trauma or PTSD. They could have processed that well, and they could have a place of wholeness in the aftermath of that terrible event. And so we don't want to assume that they have trauma, but we do want to be curious about that. And because I think a lot of times therapists, mental health therapists included, is You experience physical abuse. You have trauma. I have actually worked with people who experience physical abuse, and in the time that they're coming to me for other concerns, maybe marriage concerns or something that's unrelated to the physical abuse that they experienced, they process it just fine over time, and they're okay, and they don't have trauma now. And so to assume that they do and try to do work on something that wouldn't be necessary is, a fool's errand. Like, we don't need to go to that unless it's presenting problems. And so that's really important. But on the other end, we also need to understand that there are things that shouldn't be traumatic by what culture calls, would say is like a stereotypical like traumatic event, and yet they are actually experiencing trauma. One of the biggest blocks for a young woman that I was working with, she was involved in a fender bender. Like, everybody was okay. Nobody was even had a scratch on them. It was just, fender bender at a red light. She just pulled up too far. I think she was texting and bumped in the person in front of her. And yet that experience, which was just a tiny little fender bender, gave her a trauma response. And she had trauma because of that. And the biggest block was the fact that she felt like she shouldn't. And we couldn't actually even get to the work because she felt like it was silly that she was even having trauma responses to that event. And so it's on both ends of the spectrum. We want to make sure that we're not just assuming because somebody experienced something bad that they would have trauma, but we also don't want to assume that just because something doesn't seem like that stereotypical like trauma event that they can't have trauma. And that's just showing up with curiosity on both ends of the spectrum of that. So why do we need this at all? And why do we need to be identifying? And y'all gave me a bunch of reasons right off the bat, but the statistics are actually pretty significant. And so, as you can see here, people who experience trauma are 15 times more likely to attempt suicide, 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop sexually transmitted diseases, 4 times more likely to inject drugs, 3 times more likely to use antidepressant medication, 3 times more likely to be absent from work, 3 times more likely to experience depression, 25 times more likely to smoke, and 2 times more likely to have serious financial problems. Most of the people that y'all are working with are coming with a lot of these things already, but if the trauma remains untreated, factors here that they are not experiencing, they can experience in the future if there's not interventions that we're getting them connected with. Most other adults, older adults who have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetime, that's most of us. Y'all have already shared in the room multiple people who have experienced trauma, PTSD. I myself have experienced trauma. 21% of children live in poverty. Poverty by itself and the financial difficulties of that does not have to be traumatic, but can be traumatic. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 13 men have experienced childhood sexual abuse, and 1 in 5 women experience adult sexual assault and dating or violence. People are always shocked when I share those last 2 statistics. 1 in 5 women have experienced sexual assault or dating violence. That's astronomical. I really want us to go into a good understanding of exactly what it is that we're dealing with. Anybody who has ever done therapy with me or been in a training with me has heard about the bear. And the bear is the metaphor that I use to try to explain PTSD and trauma to people. I honestly talk about the bear so much, the bear should probably be like part of my branding and logo, quite frankly. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you and a person you care about is walking in the woods, just on a lovely hike. As you're walking on that hike, you're able to have connecting conversations. You're able to hear what they're sharing with you. You're able to process what they're saying, respond calmly. Your heart rate is relatively low. You're calm. Your digestive system's operating normally. Your breathing is regulated. Everything is set up in your body to just really enjoy this experience with the person that you care about. And in that moment, you are in one of your 2 nervous systems. You're in your parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is given to us to be that social, connecting, empathetic, neuro-mirroring element of ourselves that allow us to connect with other humans, socialize, find love, procreate, and continue Homo sapien, right? Like that's the purpose of that parasympathetic nervous system. But as you're walking in the woods, all of a sudden a bear busts through the trees and it's running at you. And in a nanosecond, before you can even say the word bear, your brain has processed that threat. There is now a threat to my safety, a threat to my survival. And in that nanosecond, your brain has flipped. And when I say flipped is all the power that was in your prefrontal cortex has now been driven to your amygdala. And your amygdala, which is like the part of your brain that is assessing for threat and ready to flip that alarm switch in that nanosecond, it takes over. Sometimes we call that our reptile brain, just the survive at all cost brain. And you get a shot of adrenaline from your adrenal gland. Your heart rate increases. Your breathing becomes rapid. Energy, oxygenated blood, adrenaline coursing through my veins, getting to my muscles so that I can run even faster. And so we are biologically wired for survival. It's the way that, and when you really think about it, like we are the offspring of the greatest survivalists, the greatest nervous systems that Homo sapien has had to offer. Any Homo sapien that had a bad sympathetic nervous system response or a slow sympathetic nervous system response probably got killed by the bear generations ago. They didn't pass along their bad, sympathetic nervous system response. So only those with the really good ones procreated, and we're the offspring of the best. Those who have survived best, right? Which is awesome because if we're ever with a bear in the woods, we have a pretty good shot. But as we'll see, that actually really causes a lot of problems as well, right? We are these survivalists, and it's really amazing what our body does and has been designed to do to keep us safe. So butterflies in your stomach. Why, when I get nervous, do I feel butterflies in my stomach? Well, if a bear is chasing me, or if a bear is busting through the trees coming at me, I need all the energy, all the calories that I can have to go into fighting or flighting from that bear. And so what I don't need right now is to be digesting food. That's a waste of energy right now. Burning those calories to do that doesn't make any sense. So when we feel butterflies in our stomach, it's literally our sympathetic nervous system cutting off our digestive system, stopping it, and we feel the physical sensations and effects of that process happening, right? But it also pulls from all other unnecessary things that's not going to help me survive well. For example, if I'm in the woods with you and the bear is running at us and I turn to look at you and I'm like, hey, just want to say, like, you really matter to me. You're a great person. I really appreciate you. I really hope that we survive this because you're just a really important person to me. That communication, your ability to hear those words and process them and feel them, like that we're both dead already. The bear has attacked us before we're able to address those words. So our brain has been trained to say no, we don't want to be able to hear another person's voice. We don't want to be able to have communication with another person. That slows us down. That might keep me from running. That might keep me from fighting. The part of my brain that hears the human voice and processes what's being said, it cuts off because that's not helpful and that is contrary to my survival. Which is really dumb because if you're married or you're in any sort of, romantic relationship, or even when it comes to, our internal family, when are we typically having conversations about our feelings and what frustrates us and what's going wrong right now? When our nervous systems are kicked into gear, we're in the middle of an argument, and the other person doesn't have the ability, literally their brain will not let them really hear us and process what we're saying. So it really helps me out if there's a bear in the woods. It doesn't help me out if I'm in conflict. Another thing that our body does when we go into this fight or flight mode, we all of a sudden lack empathy. So I don't know if you've ever seen like any zombie movie, zombie show. Who's always the person who gets killed by the zombies? The person who goes and helps. I'm going to go save them, right? So they put themselves into danger, and they're the one who ends up getting killed by the zombies. Like literally, empathy is like the number one trait. Like if I'm like, oh, they're a really empathetic person, like, well, they'll be first to go in the zombie apocalypse, right? Because their empathy, like our brain, when we go into that survival mode, our brain turns us off from empathy. It doesn't mean that we are completely unable to find empathy, varying degrees of how much fight or flight we're in, but we do not have our full capacity to feel empathy for another person when we're in fight or flight. It is contrary to survival, and biologically we're wired to limit that when our fight or flight's engaged. You can see like, hey, if there's a bear in the woods and that's what I am biologically wired to survive against, all of the things that I just talked about, when my sympathetic nervous system takes over, those things keep me alive. Those things are my best chance at surviving.